Hello, welcome to On Air. I'm Klara Syrewicz. Wars aren't just fought on the battlefield, they're contests of financial stamina. Today we look at NATO and EU defence spending and the opportunities and hazards that lie ahead. In protracted conflicts, pooling resources and raising cash often determines who wins. Europe has recently been reminded of this the hard way. Hopes of a ceasefire in Ukraine evaporated. The conflict is now a war of attrition, not just on the battlefield, but in energy markets and in state coffers. Ukraine is spiraling into a brutal cash crunch. Without support, it will be out of money in the new year, just as Russian forces batter its energy grid and make the most significant territorial gains since the war began. This year, Donald Trump slashed US financial support for Ukraine and scaled back American involvement in NATO. Though Europe has finally set aside major funds for its own defence, its political fragmentation and procurement failures are major risks, especially when scrambling to find money for Ukraine. While the outlook is grim and the choice is tough, there are a few silver linings. Europe is already in a low-intensity war with Russia, at least according to its military leaders. That's bad news. But for countries like Poland and the Baltic states, the mere fact that Europe finally recognizes the threat from Moscow is a colossal success. This level of European defence cooperation and spending would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Just think that Germany was still funding training and modernization for the Russian army months before its invasion of Crimea, and Nord Stream 2 rolled ahead smoothly right up until 2022. Even countries that still flirt with Moscow, like Hungary, Slovakia and Serbia, are aware they're walking a very fine line. Since no one wants a full-scale war, at least EU leaders agree that strong deterrence is essential. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, a former defence minister, has built up the EU's military muscle, taking the bloc far beyond its usual comfort zone focused on economics. Several tools are already up and running. The European Defence Fund finances R&D through grants, while the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, launched this year, will boost financing for military buyers and suppliers. It also wants to streamline Europe's procurement rules, which the bank's founder politely described as a disaster. Indeed, the European defence market is gangrened by national favouritism, small order volumes and significant technological gaps. Unless countries pool purchases and stop fragmentation, higher demand will simply push prices up and shrink competition. And then there's the most audacious instrument, the Security Action for Europe, or SAFE, pushed through under the Polish Council presidency. It fills urgent defence needs with up to 150 billion euros in Commission-backed loans. While non-EU states like the UK, Canada and Ukraine can join its projects, only members may receive loans, and then only if they coordinate purchases with at least one other EU country. This month, EU members must submit investment plans to access those funds. I can't wait to see what Hungary will propose. Perhaps an armoured leisure yacht for Orban. Predictably, not all capitals see eye to eye on how much to spend, let alone on what. Kremlin-friendly countries like Hungary and Slovakia have jumped on the additional cash. Orban and Fico's cronies, like well-trained truffle pigs, have suddenly acquired big chunks of the local defence industry. But other countries, like Spain, play down the risk of war to shield strained budgets. France, with its state-dependent defence industry, worries those funds will be used to buy overpriced US weapons and Trump's favour. Meanwhile, the Netherlands, Sweden and Germany are wary of taking on more debt to support Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine's spending presents the toughest challenge. Last month, EU leaders failed to approve a loan backed by 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, though a new bid has been launched this week. But the EU's latest critical candidacy assessment of Ukraine's governance fuels worries that a blank cheque might turbocharge corruption. But at least all European countries are on the same page when it comes to strengthening their borders after Russian drones wandered as far as Copenhagen. But, of course there's a but, deciding what deserves top priority is not that obvious. Here's an urgent concern for most of Europe: the war in Ukraine. Just kidding, we all know that. No, this one should be at least sounding alarms in Malta, France, and even sleepy Spain. Tenemos un problema grande. A looming security headache is brewing in Libya. The country, over 3 times the size of Spain, is essentially a failed state at Europe's doorstep. And it functions under Russia's growing influence through arms deliveries and a new Russian naval base in Tobruk. General Khalifa Haftar, the local warlord, operates smuggling networks that help Moscow evade sanctions and, most concerningly, weaponize migration. There's been a considerable rise in illegal crossings this year, almost entirely from Libya, against a 20% drop on all other major routes. Tackling this mess calls for heavyweights like the US and France, but despite efforts by Italy and Greece to raise the alarm, they haven't seen much traction. And so we move on to the next pitfall, namely trying to get the big NATO guy to actually collaborate on anything.
That is very difficult when the US president, the biggest ally in the NATO alliance, says, "Feel free to shoot Russian jets down, but whether I have your backs, I don't know."
On the intelligence front, the US appears to have come round, especially after the Israel-Hamas deal, which relied heavily on cooperation with multiple European spy agencies. But militarily, the picture is less rosy. The EU is essentially being pushed into buying US equipment for Ukraine in exchange for flimsy promises. To cope with the US stepping back from direct transfers, NATO has set up a mechanism allowing European allies to fund US weapons for Ukraine, called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL. The name sounds cute, but the math is brutal. Under this program, deliveries lag and the bill is exorbitant. Reuters reports Ukraine will need between $12 and $20 billion in platform purchases next year. And countries like France or Germany must swallow the bitter pill. In the short term, Europe can't hesitate to buy the weapons Ukraine needs, like air defense systems, even if later spending could favor European firms and Ukraine's own defense tech sector. Then, besides the obvious problems with dwindling resources, the EU and NATO also face their own demons of misallocation or outright corruption. The pandemic has shown that throwing large sums at urgent needs without proper oversight can lead to many problemas grandes, like overpaying for Pfizer vaccines or, in Poland's case, turning COVID relief funds into business expenses like coffee makers, furniture and tanning beds. In 2025, EU defence spending hit a record €392 billion. On average, EU countries now allocate 2.1% of their GDP to the military, with plans to increase this to 5%. Of that, 3.5 is earmarked for core defence, but 1.5 for resilience, innovation and infrastructure. With lax regulation, governments are tempted to invest funds in areas where they can score political points, not necessarily where they are needed. And this opens the door for a lot of unsavoury interests. Across the EU, procurement transparency is patchy. Even in peacetime, military purchases often get cloaked in secrecy, though building a new factory or ordering submarines can hardly stay secret and won't affect how the enemy prepares for conflict. What matters is the strategic movement of troops or equipment and technological details, as we saw in the recent devastating Russian hack of sensitive Ukrainian drone data. But overblown secrecy combined with the rush to buy generates inflated contracts and dodgy deals. Troops may end up with inferior equipment, and taxpayers won't get the security they paid for. For instance, under the Law and Justice government, Poland carried out a massive arms buying spree, often bypassing public tenders. This year, the centrist coalition opened an investigation into a €22 million consulting fee paid by a South Korean arms supplier to a small local company linked to politically connected insiders. Authorities suspect the payment was a smokescreen for bogus invoices or kickbacks. In Lithuania, an uproar sparked by overpriced army utensils, the golden spoon scandal, led the country to post all major contracts within 30 days. But it's not just individual states that fall prey to corruption. Entire institutions are vulnerable. The recent NATO-gate scandal, with 4 separate probes spanning 11 countries, uncovered bribery and fraud in defence deals, all routed through NATO's procurement arm, the NSPA. Given NATO's shopping spree nearly tripled from 2021 to a whopping €9.5 billion in 2025, the corruption incentive grew proportionally. Now, did these scandals surface because of improved vigilance, or are they symptoms of systemic failures? The immune response did come, but rather late and without triggering oversight reform. Most worryingly, key suspects in the US walked free under murky circumstances. If anything, these examples should prod the EU into really paying attention as it establishes new procurement habits. Besides optimizing them, their transparency should be, well, bulletproof, because it translates into greater security. As The Economist notes, Europe should take confidence in its own strength. With a military budget 4 times that of Russia and an economy 10 times larger, Europe and NATO, if they spend wisely, can embrace a fiscal duel with the Kremlin. And Putin doesn't have a retirement plan. He is left with few options but to double down. The massive resources he's ploughed into capturing a single city after 3 years of carnage show he's willing to pay any price and that only financial ruin can stop him. Whether Trump knows it or forgets it in a few weeks, Europe's approach shouldn't change. A Ukrainian defeat would leave Europe facing another destabilized state at its doorstep, with a massive army and defense sector at peril of being exploited by Russia. If Europe can underwrite the war for at least another few years, it stands a real chance of ending it on livable terms and affirm its military independence. The bill for Europe and Ukraine is indeed very high, but considering the alternative, it's actually a bargain. Europe's political drama features a familiar face back in the spotlight. It's him again, ladies and gentlemen, your favorite, Viktor Orbán. When he's not spying on EU institutions or stirring political ferment in Ukraine's internal politics, he's also building coalitions with like-minded politicians. Today we look at his latest shenanigans and ask whether Brussels should worry or whether he's just buying time before his curtain call.
A potential new political alliance is taking shape, one that could challenge the European Union's unified stance on the war in Ukraine. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is reportedly seeking to join forces with the Czech Republic and Slovakia to form an anti-Ukraine bloc inside the EU.
Brussels has decided to go to war. The pro-war countries have already formed a war alliance with inimitable elegance, calling it a coalition of the willing to send others to their deaths.
Orbán's political director, Balázs Orbán, said Budapest is hoping to coordinate policies with Czech leader Andrej Babiš, whose right-wing populist party recently won elections, and with Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, who has long echoed Orbán's skepticism toward EU sanctions on Russia.
This is why I want to say openly at this meeting that we are extremely interested in the normalization of the relationship between the Slovak Republic and the Russian Federation. Let's look for areas where our two countries can most successfully cooperate.
The 3 leaders could begin holding regular pre-summit meetings ahead of European Council gatherings, effectively forming a smaller version of the Visegrad Group, which originally included Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland. Balázs Orbán has compared the cooperation to the Visegrad Alliance's resistance to EU migration policies during the 2015 refugee crisis. But this time, Poland is unlikely to join.
It's unacceptable, not only from my point of view, that one country can block the other one, especially in the context of the war with Russia in Ukraine. And this is why we have to press our friends in Budapest to do what they should do.
Such an alliance could complicate EU efforts to maintain unity on sanctions and military support for Kiev, decisions that require consensus among member states. But at home, Viktor Orbán faces perhaps his toughest political battle in over a decade. After nearly 15 years in power, His Fidesz party trails in the polls ahead of next year's national election. The opposition, led by Peter Magyar and his rising TISA party, has gained momentum by promising to repair ties with Brussels and tackle corruption. With pressure mounting both at home and abroad, Orbán's next moves in Brussels and Budapest could determine his political future and Hungary's role in Europe.
Well, 1 week without some Orban news is a week lost. Have a great evening, and I'll see you soon.